I'm splitting this into 2 videos. It'll be coming out next week, hopefully. I don't know. Well, that was a long week. At long last, welcome back to Screen to Stage, What the Difference, whatever I'm calling this series now. I kind of changed my mind after filming the last one, that there's going to be like a slight variation on What's the Difference, but they're the same thing, basically. I've been waiting to return to this series to finish out the differences between the film Beetlejuice and the musical Beetlejuice. And, you know, I couldn't quite do that because Hollywood studios were being a little bit stinky, but now that's all been sorted out, the strike is over, now we can return to Beetlejuice. In the first video, we focused on Act 1 of the musical and the first half of the film, and today we're going to dive into Act 2. So if you haven't seen the first part of this video series, you should probably go do that. Or don't, watch this one first if you want to, I'm not your mum. But if you haven't seen my face before, hi, I'm Elliot, I talk about theatre. I am the most chaotic theatre person on the internet. I do reviews, I do discussions, I do video essays, and if any of that sounds interesting to you, please consider hitting like and subscribe. It really helps me out, helps out the channel. But let's go into Beetlejuice. Now, to recap quickly, to get us up to speed again, musical Beetlejuice has just kind of scared the entire house out of there and now partnered with Lydia and they're running the house together. And film Beetlejuice, after being summoned by the Maitlands, was all like, I'm a snake, and almost killed Charles, leading to Lydia getting very angry. Now, Act 1 of the musical and the first hour of the film do follow an extremely similar path. It's Act 2 where this kind of just completely splits off. You can see the areas of influence on the musical writers where they've taken things and taken ideas from the film, but pretty much it's completely different. It's almost strange to compare the two, knowing how much they differ. But I mean, that's the whole goal of this series, isn't it? As previously mentioned, the film version of Beetlejuice is so easily unsummoned, and he finds his way back into the model town in the attic after his attack. He yells at Adam and Barbara for interrupting his great work. He makes some kind of gross remarks towards Lydia, becomes a hedgehog, and then goes into a conveniently placed adult establishment. Adam and Barbara then find themselves teleported back into the DMV-style Netherworld, where they are preparing to have another meeting with their social worker, as I'm going to dub her. She's basically a social worker, Juno. She's ready to see them, even if she's being pestered by this entire team of American footballers who have all passed away. Juno reveals that she is the one who planted the whorehouse, in her words, and berates Adam and Barbara for their constant mistakes. And I mean, fair and valid. They have screwed up many a time. You know, they got their headshots taken, they allowed B-Man to get his way, they allowed the handbook for the recently deceased to fall into the hands of gay icon Otho. In other words, they done dig fuck up. Now, everything I've just described to you about the film, can you please take it all here, and just throw it out the window. Get rid of it, because we no longer need it, because essentially that's what the musical did to the opening of Act 2. With a reworking of the show to focus more on Lydia's story than the Maitlands, Juno's like a presence until the middle of Act 2, and the changes to the way that Beetlejuice goes about his haunting, the musical takes its own path at the start of Act 2, and plays with the idea of BJ and the Goth, that sounds like a great sitcom, running the haunted house their way. And so, in quite a contrast to the style to the film and the rest of the musical, Act 2 opens with this quite cheery song, Girl Scout. The character is less reminiscent of Beetlejuice, but still feels very Tim Burton because of his work on films like Edward Scissorhands, where he'll take something very dark and macabre and just juxtapose it and put it right next to a very overly sanitized and very clean image. In the case of something like Edward Scissorhands, that is a contrast between the character of Edward and the suburban 50s America image of the perfect town. This brave little girl who suffers from a rare heart condition is preparing to sell her cookies, and just happens to start at the creepiest house in town. Great idea, girl. I actually really adore starting Act 2 like this. It's not what you're expecting at all, and it leads into what I think is not controversial when I say it, one of the most entertaining and fun songs in the entire musical. that beautiful sound. And we get to explore the outburst of joy with both Beetlejuice and Lydia and their newfound freedom in this wonderfully chaotic number that just builds and builds and builds. It's so much fun. After the song, Beetlejuice runs down all the rules of haunting your very own house, and they are as followed. Number 1, don't leave the house. This is because of sandworms. Now, the sandworm is a small part of both the musical and the film. If you remember in part 1 of this video, the first time we see it in the film is when Adam and Barbara try to leave the house. And the first time we see it in the musical, it's actually a short cameo in Beetlejuice's opening number, The Whole Being Dead thing. In the film, it's explained a lot earlier what the sandworms are and about their diet, and this is something that we learn here in the musical. And funnily enough, the sandworm is very integral to the ending of both versions in a slightly different way. Rule number 2. Every new ghost gets a tote bag! I don't think it will surprise you to learn that this rule is not in the film. But what's interesting is that in this tote bag, there's a copy of the handbook for the recently deceased, which Beetlejuice tries to distract Lydia from. In the film, this just kind of appears in the house when Adam and Barbara return from passing away. But obviously in the musical, they have a little bit more fun with it. I don't know. I think a tote bag's fun. And rule number 3, we don't get to learn it because Lydia is still so focused on that book and thinks it may be the way to find her mum. Obviously, being an honorary ghost, she can't open this book. One of the key changes from the film to the musical, as you'll see a little bit later, that it's quite important that mortals can open the book because of the plot surrounding Otho in the film. And in the musical, when Beetlejuice refuses to open the book for her, she leaves and goes back up to the attic to try and find Barbara and Adam. Beetlejuice is alone yet again. And we all know how this version of Beetlejuice hates to be alone. And determined to not be anymore, Beetlejuice starts to hatch a plan to ask Lydia to marry him. It's a green card thing. This is a plot in both the film and the musical. However, the intentions of Beetlejuice feel a little bit nicer, let's use that word, in the musical than the film. In the musical, we're kind of fine with it, because it's very clear that Beetlejuice is only using it as a way to bring himself back to life. But the Beetlejuice in the film is constantly making harassing comments towards Lydia. We know for a fact that he is just an absolute pervert. He is creepy. And so the second this comes up, you are absolutely mortified at the thought. But in both, this is a way to bring him back to life. Back to the film, and here is where we return to Charles and Delia, something that doesn't happen until a little bit later in the musical. In the film, despite Beetlejuice's haunting being arguably more brutal, the Deetz family isn't actually chased out of the house due to the intervention of Barbara, so we find them chilling on the worst outside terrace I have ever seen. Jesus Christ, Otho, I love you, but man, what is your plan here? They have a brief discussion about how staying here may be a bad idea and a bad idea for Lydia, until Otho enters and starts to hint at the fact that he may know a little bit about the supernatural now because of the fact that he has the handbook for the recently deceased. Now, obviously, if this was the musical, him having this book would not make a difference because he wouldn't even be able to open it. The film then turns the attention back onto Lydia, and this is where she decides to end her life. We find her writing her note in her bedroom, and it's interesting to note how both the film and the musical do have this plot point, but it's actually a lot earlier in the musical version. As we saw in the previous video, I discussed this and how it's actually the moment when Lydia finds out that Charles and Delia are together that she decides to go up to the roof. With Charles and Delia in the film already having been together for seemingly a while, and a lot of Lydia's plot not really being focused on her mother's death, this has changed a lot for the musical version. But while film Lydia is writing her note, the Maitlands are finishing up their meeting with Juno, and this is where we get the iconic sequence of them and their last kind of ditch effort to scare the Deetzes out of their house. Iconic is the only word that you can use to describe this, as they pull their faces and stretch it in really horrific ways to form their scary personas, I'm going to call them. Like, the image of these two in these forms is probably one of the longest lasting images from the Beetlejuice film. So while they're perfecting their scary look, Lydia goes up to the attic to try and find the Maitlands, but instead finds Beetlejuice still in the model. And this scene mirrors what in the musical becomes Say My Name. As in both versions, it's Beetlejuice trying to convince Lydia to summon them and playing a form of charades. Film Beetlejuice is a lot calmer than Brightman's quite manic version. There's moments of impatience during Michael Keaton's version of Beetlejuice, which you can very clearly see, especially when he's trying to get her to spell out the name and he's getting really impatient as she's not quite getting the word juice. But he seems a lot more collected in this moment. This does make a lot of sense with the differences between the two versions, with Keaton's Beetlejuice, being a lot more cunning and certainly a lot more villainous, and Brightman's Beetlejuice just being like a guy who hasn't seen anyone for like 50 million bajillion years. But just in time, Adam and Barbara return to the attic and stop Lydia from saying Beetlejuice's name a third time. They briefly scare her because they're still in their quite horrific forms, but they mold themselves back together again, even if it does take Adam a little bit longer than Barbara. Barbara takes this moment to talk to Lydia. Lydia confiding in Barbara that she was planning to take her life, and Barbara talking her down from it. And she promises that things are going to get better because they've decided to allow the Deetz family to stay. But before they can go down to talk to the Deetzes, the Deetz family crash into the attic and take the model downstairs. This is a perfect time to switch back to focus on the musical again, because in this moment in the musical, we have the Maitlands in the attic. In this version, they're trying to brainstorm ideas to stop Beetlejuice and save Lydia. Lydia enters the attic holding the handbook. This is the first time that the Maitlands actually see the handbook in the musical, it having such a strong presence in the first half of the film. It actually has pretty much none in the musical. This is due to the fact that when the Maitlands die in the musical version, Beetlejuice takes the book and throws it into the fireplace after performing a very cute puppet show. But sometimes puppet shows are sad. So, this is the first time they've seen it in the musical, and Adam opens the book, reading it, and for the first time in the musical, drawing a gateway to the Netherworld, which is drawn in the exact same way that it is in the film, by getting a piece of chalk, drawing the outline of a door, and knocking 3 times. The key difference from the film Netherworld to the musical Netherworld is that it seems a little bit hypnotic, and when the gateway is opened, Adam seems possessed and starts to slowly walk towards the Netherworld. Thankfully, they manage to close the door and stop Adam before he goes in, but Barbara deems the book too dangerous and stops Lydia from going in to find her mum. Annoyed by this, she runs off. It's unclear in the film whether or not a mortal can enter the Netherworld, so I'm hesitant to say whether this is an aspect of the rules that was changed for the musical. But what is clearly changed is the attitude towards the Netherworld. Going from this quite boring space with undead people to this ethereal, hypnotic presence, and this clear danger and being very void-like, which we see later on, is quite a stark contrast. But we'll explore that a little bit later on. With Lydia gone, the Maitlands are left to reflect on their lives, and they do this through the song Barbara 2.0, deciding to use their backbone finally and fight back against Beetlejuice. Meanwhile, downstairs, the Deetz family re-enter the house, crucifix in hand. This is where we finally meet the musical's version of Otho. Obviously, we know film Otho as the gay icon, not-so-style genius, queen of the side-eye, lover of books he should not be reading. But in the musical, especially in Act 1, he's more of just a name that's kind of thrown out, and he becomes more of this life coach to Delia. This is quite a contrast to the film where he's literally just a personal friend. But musical Otho does show up here to help exorcise Beetlejuice out of the house. The 3 of them leave to go get some equipment out of Otho's car, but Lydia catches a glimpse of them as she's coming down from the attic. She tells Beetlejuice that she is ready to go into the Netherworld to find her mum. And this is where Beetlejuice starts to put his plan into motion, telling her that when the Maitlands try to exorcise him, if she performs a chant, it will be her mother who shows up instead. A classic bait and switch. The three return and set up their little box of horrors. And Lydia pretends to be possessed by Beetlejuice, commanding them to leave. At this very moment, the Maitlands come rushing down from the attic and suddenly their gang's all here. And just in time for Lydia to perform her chant, which, instead of showing her mother, starts to exorcise Barbara. The bait and switch was baited and then switched. Plot twist. The fourth part of the whole being dead thing plays here, as Beetlejuice enjoys the chaos of this moment, seeing his plans succeed, and declares that the only way that he will stop Barbara from dying is if Lydia agrees to marry him, which gets exactly the response that the film version should have got. But hey, it's a green card thing. She reluctantly agrees, and Beetlejuice sets up the portal to send the Maitlands into the Netherworld for good. But guess what? The bait and switch that was baited and then switched finds a way to switch it up again, as we find out that Lydia has baited Beetlejuice. That was a really hard sentence to say. Lydia jumps into the Netherworld herself, and she is swiftly followed by Charles, who chases her in just as the portal closes. Beetlejuice is livid, and with the people he's got left, it's time for revenge. Now, pretty much none of that happens in the film. It's all been invented for the musical, but there is one key link in that sequence to the film, and that's the idea of exorcism. So let's catch up a bit on the film again. Maxie Dean finally visits. In the musical, they kind of smush the party guests from Deo with the character of Maxie Dean. Also, fun fact, in the musical, the wife's name is Maxine Dean. In the film, her name's Sarah. In this moment, we see Charles trying desperately to pitch his gated community to Maxie Dean, but he is so much more interested in the ghosts. But Lydia comes down and informs the group that the Maitlands have gone, which is a subtle lie. But the truth of what she says is that they promise to come back if the Deetz family promises to not use them as an attraction or force them to do cheap tricks. Otho, however, with the knowledge he has gained from reading the handbook, susses out the lie here and starts the process of summoning them. Or so he thinks. Gathered around with the Maitlands' wedding clothes laid out on the table, Otho starts the chant, and we see the Maitlands from the attic start to disappear and appear into the wedding clothes. But it starts to go wrong, and the Maitlands start aging rapidly and turning to dust. Otho is misunderstood, and instead of just summoning them, this is an exorcism. He doesn't know how to reverse it, and in a moment of panic, Lydia only has one person to turn to. She runs to the model, and there is Beetlejuice, finally in the iconic striped suit look that we know and love. As you can see, the idea of exorcism exists in both versions. It is quite funny that in both versions as well, it is the Maitlands, or at least in the musicals version, one of the Maitlands, who are forced to suffer this fate. I mean, it makes sense that they're the ones who go for it, seeing as they're the ones who are dead, but yeah. But yes, Lydia in the film finally turns to Beetlejuice for help, and overjoyed, he tells her that he will stop the exorcism if she summons him and promises to marry him. With nowhere else to turn, Lydia says his name 3 times. Now, we're already in the end game of the film version, whereas we've only really touched like the first part of Act 2. This is because the events that make up Act 1 of the musical are about an hour of the film's 90-minute length. So let's kind of rush through some of the more exclusive moments in the musical to kind of get us up to speed and catch us back up to the climax of both versions. Lydia enters the void-like Netherworld, presented in the musical version with these kind of crooked squares going backwards and backwards and backwards, making this like empty void hallway effect. Both Lydia and Charles are greeted in the musical by the Netherworldians? Netherworlders? The people of the Netherworld? Yeah, including Miss Argentina, who in the film works as the receptionist. She seems to have a similar job here, even if the entire aesthetic of the boring office is gone. Miss Argentina asks to see Lydia's handbook, and she reveals that she's not dead. This panics Miss Argentina, and she begs Lydia to go before Juno sees her. And this quickly breaks into the fantastic Act 2 crowd pleaser number, What I Know Now. A song which mirrors and pretty much completely takes the iconic line from the film. If I knew then what I know now, I wouldn't have had my little accident. After the song, Juno enters. In the film, she looks very human, and the musical very much completely redesigns her, and certainly making her a lot less caring. What does stay between the two versions is the idea of her being a smoker and having the smoke rise out of her throat. Now, despite being very brutal in the film, it's still clear that film Juno wants to help out. But this is less of the case for musical Juno, who pretty much decides like that to murder this child and her father. Real classy one, Juno. Thankfully, Lydia runs past her in order to find her mum, and Charles follows. She runs through empty void to empty void until she stops and sings her 11 o'clock number, Home. Partway through this song, Charles enters and they finally have a discussion about Lydia's mum. And we get a nice exploration of how Charles has been struggling to deal with this, how he's having to push everything to the side in order to carry on without her. They reconnect as a family and prepare to leave the Netherworld and save everyone from Beetlejuice. Funnily enough, now in both the musical and the film, it's showtime! Crashing through the model, film Beetlejuice rises up in this very circus, carnival filmed outfit, topped with this headpiece which actually has the head of Jack Skellington on it, if you notice that little detail. And he starts to cause havoc. His arms inflate into these two large hammers as carnival games rise behind Maxie and Sarah Dean. Beetlejuice raises them up, slams them down, and sends the pair flying out the roof of the house. Yeah, they're dead. They're so dead. He undoes the exorcism, he grabs Otho as he's trying to run and leaves him standing there in double denim, which is enough to scar our icon for life and send him running away crying. Beetlejuice quickly meets his in-laws and makes the worst first impression ever, and gets ready for his wedding. Well, you know the saying. Married in red, better off dead. Musical Beetlejuice has a similar vibe, as he forces the Maitlands and Delia to play through a game show. Musical Beetlejuice has a very similar vibe, as he forces the Maitlands and Delia to play through this game show, with Otho being attached to the spin wheel. This is where we get the realization that Otho is a fraud, and that his name's not even Otho. And this is why musical Otho is a disrespect to my king, film Otho. Don't worry, baby, I still love you, double denim and all. Lydia and Charles return, and Lydia starts her plan. She pretends to be ready to marry him, and they prepare for the wedding with the song Creepy Old Guy. This is a pretty nice way to still have the plot from the film with the wedding, but to kind of make fun of it and still make it work in a more modern retelling of Beetlejuice. This is not to say, though, that I don't think it works in the film, because these two versions are trying to do a very different thing with Beetlejuice. It works in the film because we're not meant to like film Beetlejuice. Film Beetlejuice is literally the worst thing in the history of anything ever. We can enjoy him as a villain, sure, but you're not meant to like him. You're not meant to agree with him. But with a lot more focus in the musical on Beetlejuice's character, it kind of needs you to like him a bit more. And this is why they give him a lot more of a backstory. This is why they give him more of a reason of why he does what he does. Because he's lonely, because he seeks friendship. And so the musical kind of makes fun of this idea and satirizes the idea of creepy, gross men who feel the need to harass women. They walk the aisle, say I do, and suddenly Beetlejuice is alive once again. And in 5 seconds, he goes through the stages of grief in one short monologue where he goes from happy to sad to angry to murderous to being murdered by Lydia. Didn't see that one coming. It's a bait, switch, and murder. Oldest trick in the book. The wedding is quite stretched out in the film, whereas only the first part of the climax of the musical version. Beetlejuice turns Delia's statues into chairs that entrap the Deetz family so they can be witnesses to the wedding, as the Maitlands slowly undust. An officiant comes out of the fireplace and Beetlejuice breaks the fourth wall, wondering whether or not he should say I do. Lydia straight up refuses, leading to Beetlejuice mimicking her voice to make sure that she says I do. The rest of the film's climax is a fight to unsummon Beetlejuice. Adam tries first, running in and saying Beetlejuice. But Beetlejuice snaps his finger and sends Adam straight back into the model. Barbara tries it next, but after the first Beetlejuice, he summons a zip over her mouth. She unzips it and says it again. So doubles down and padlocks her entire mouth. And just to make sure that there is absolutely nothing she can do, he also manages to send her outside to face the sandworm. Adam's not down and out for the count yet though, as he gets into the car on the model, drives it straight into Beetlejuice's foot. As Barbara crashes back into the house, now riding the sandworm, which crashes down, devours Beetlejuice, and finally the threat is gone. The wedding is stopped, and that's it for the film's climax. So let's head back to the musical and focus on Beetlejuice's re-unaliving. Now that once again Beetlejuice is recently deceased, the Maitlands draw a door to the Netherworld, and Beetlejuice starts to walk towards it. But who comes out of it? None other than Juno, who immediately recognizes Beetlejuice. Now, we know that in the film, Juno has a relationship with Beetlejuice. Juno used to be Beetlejuice's mentor, but the relationship is even closer in the musical, as it's revealed that Juno is Beetlejuice's mother. It's very clear that they do not have a good relationship, and they have a slight argument, but very quickly, Juno gets back to the matter at hand, sending Lydia back into the Netherworld. She argues against this, saying that she's decided to stick to life, but Juno is having none of it. Luckily, Beetlejuice has snuck off and comes back, crashing into the house, riding the sandworm. And it comes and it eats Juno. I mean, it's weird that it happens twice. With the threat gone, Beetlejuice decides it's time to leave and find his dad. Proper sequel bait, as he says. Ironic that this is the line written for the musical, pre-Beetlejuice 2 actually being a thing that's happening. He says his goodbyes and heads straight into the Netherworld. The house is an absolute mess, but everything is resolved with a nice bow as the Maitlands decide to allow the Deetz family to stay and they clean up the mess together. The film has a similar conclusion with a slight time skip. We see Lydia leaving school, heading home where Adam and Barbara are redecorating. They seem to be taking on a much more active role in parenting Lydia than the Deetzes, who are upstairs relaxing and chilling. And after a little sneak hint into the Netherworld offices, as we see Beetlejuice waiting and eventually getting his head shrunk, the film ends with Jump in the Line, as Adam and Barbara use their ghostly powers to lift up Lydia up the banister. This is something that the musical and the film share, as the musical version ends with Jump in the Line as well, and has a very similar trick where they lift up Lydia. So, at the end of all of that, what's the difference? Quite a lot. I've gone through it all. It had to be split into 2 videos. It's really interesting how much Beetlejuice changed just because of the target demographic the musical was going for. The musical wanted to appeal a lot more to a younger audience, and having the Maitlands as the leads wasn't the strongest idea for that. And so instead for the musical, they turned to 2 of the more iconic characters from the film, Lydia and Beetlejuice himself, who only has about 10 minutes of screen time in the entire film. But beyond all of that, I think what the most interesting thing about this is that both versions really work for what they're trying to achieve. When it comes to stage adaptations, I wish we got more that were willing to mold the stories to embrace a different medium, like Beetlejuice the musical does. If you sum up the basic plots of both the Beetlejuice film and the Beetlejuice musical, they're essentially the same gist, but the journey you go on is so different by simply adjusting the character the show wants to focus on. But what do you think? What's your favourite? The film version of Beetlejuice or the musical version of Beetlejuice? Are you like me and enjoy both for what they are? Let me know all your thoughts on all of these differences in the comments down below. If you did enjoy this video, please consider hitting like and subscribe. It really helps me out, helps out the channel. Here's some links to my videos on screen right now, and a link to my Instagram if you want to drop me a follow over there. But that's it for me today, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!